Hey everyone, I got a question here that I wanted to answer on video because I know this is a point of confusion for a lot of people. And that is, Joanne wrote, can you explain why a goat should not be put into a new pasture right after deworming? I'm kind of confused about that. That is a really great question, and it really sounds like the smart thing to do, that you give your goats a dewormer and then you put them in a new pasture so that they're not consuming more worm larvae. However, the big problem with this is that if you deworm all of your goats and then you move them to a new pasture, there aren't any worms in there on day one. However, when you deworm your goat, it's not going to kill 100%. Even if the dewormer is working at its absolute best, it's only going to kill like 99%. And what's going to happen is that when they go into that new pasture, they are going to be pooping out eggs from all of the worms that survived the deworming. And the eggs are going to hatch into larvae that will grow into worms that are resistant to the dewormer that you just used. So if you deworm all of your goats and you move them into a new pasture, then 100% of the worm larvae that they are going to be consuming is from dewormer resistant worms. And we don't want to do that because we don't want our goats walking around with a load of worms that is resistant to a dewormer. We want a dewormer to work when the goats really need it. So there's really two things I'm talking about here. One is not deworming all of your goats at once, which is not recommended. I still, on a regular basis, I still talk to people who talk about deworming their goats on a schedule. And a schedule is anything that is determined by the calendar or you, anything other than your goat. So it could mean like every 3 months, every 6 months. It could mean before breeding. It could mean after kidding. Anything that you just say, I'm going to deworm my goat when, and you fill in that blank with anything other than when my goat fails the 5-point check. Because that's what you should be basing your deworming plans on now. I've got a video on the 5-point check. I have a whole podcast episode on the 5-point check where you can learn more about that and how you use it and why it's better than Fecals. And one of the main reasons is you can do the 5-point check on your goat every single day, and it's free. And it's accurate. There are many reasons why a fecal can be wrong, and it only gives you a teeny little snapshot in time. And a lot of times it gives people a false sense of security because they're like, oh, well, I did a fecal, my goat didn't have worms. Well, that doesn't mean that your goat's not going to have worms next week or next month. I even had somebody contact me one time who had goats that were terribly underweight, and she wanted to know how to put weight on them. And I said, it really sounds like they have a bad case of worms. And she's like, oh no, they had clean fecals 3 months ago. Well, that was 3 months ago. So I encouraged her to go check their eyelids, and 2 of the 3, their eyelids were white already. So that's why I really don't like fecals, because you're not going to do a fecal every other week. Even if you're doing them yourself, trust me, I know, I've been there. Back 15 to 20 years ago when we had goats dying from worms, we learned how to do fecals. I learned, both my daughters learned. And you know what? It doesn't take very long before you get tired of doing fecals. And before it was even a recommendation to use the 5-point check, that's actually what I was doing, because I found that I could tell from my goat's body condition, their poop, their FOMACHA score, all that. I knew when they needed a dewormer. And a fecal never changed that decision. So if they failed that, if they were underweight, anemic, and were pooping logs, it meant they needed a dewormer. Like when I did a fecal, it's like, yep, covered with worm larvae, worm eggs. I mean, there's worm eggs that you see on the fecal. So never changed my mind. So anyway, if you've got, let's say you've got like 20 goats and you have 1 goat that needs to be dewormed. If you want to deworm that 1 goat and then move all 20 to a new pasture, that's not so bad, because then 1/20th or 5% of the worms being pooped out in that new pasture are resistant to the dewormer. So the goats are going to be eating 95% of the worm larvae that the goats are consuming comes from worms that were not exposed to that dewormer, which means that that dewormer will still kill them. And so that's not so bad. So it really depends on how many goats you have. I know a lot of people who follow me have 4 or 5 goats. And if you're even looking at doing half of them, like 2 or 3, you really shouldn't be moving them to a new, really not a great idea to deworm them and move them to a new pasture right away, because then 50% of the worm larva that they are consuming is resistant to the dewormer that you just used. So that's basically the reason behind that recommendation. I don't want to call it a new recommendation, because really this probably been about 10 years that they've been saying not to do that. And it really goes hand in hand with not deworming the whole herd, which unfortunately I hear all the time. People still do that. And you really, really should not be doing that. If you've been doing that and for 5 years and you don't have goats dying from worms, probably means you're wasting your money. Like there's some other reason that your goats don't have a worm problem, because if your goats did have a worm problem and you were using a dewormer regularly like that on all your goats, it would not be working after more than about 2 years. In fact, we saw this in Australia and New Zealand about 10 years ago. They got a new dewormer there, which we do not have in the United States. And within 2 years, the people who were using it, the worms were resistant to it. Unfortunately, I hear this from a lot of my followers in Australia, that a lot of people there are still talking about doing all the old-fashioned things that we were doing 15 or 20 years ago that lead to dewormer resistance, which is really sad because they got that new drug. And this is why you hear me say all the time, the answer is not a new drug. The answer is not herbs. The answer is simply management. You simply have to manage your goats. And that means either like rotational grazing or a dry lot. And if you can't do either one of those, then we now have bioworma that we can use to reduce the amount of larvae that you get on your pasture. So that's a quick, maybe not so quick answer to the question of why you don't want to move goats to new pasture after deworming. But basically, like everything else, the answer is it depends. If you're only going to deworm 1 goat out of 20, not such a bad thing. But if you're giving it to like all your goats, then not good. You want to keep them in that old pasture so that they can continue to consume larvae that they pooped out before you gave them the dewormer, because the larvae the eggs that they pooped out, which hatched into larvae before you dewormed them, those worms are going to die when they get treated with that dewormer. So it's called Refugia, and you want to make sure that you've always got Refugia in your pasture. And that Refugia either needs to come from goats that were not dewormed, or from the poop that all the goats pooped out before you gave them a dewormer. And really, unless it's really, really unlikely that all your goats are going to need to be dewormed at one time. But I wouldn't say impossible, especially like if you took in some rescue goats or something that have not been managed properly in terms of parasites. But so then it's even more important for you to do everything right from the minute that you get them. So if you've got any questions, feel free to post in the comments section below and we'll get back to you. Bye for now.